Steve Accordia, thanks for joining us for this almost unique event. We have some of the great historians of the Irish in Canada. It's a project we're interested in at the embassy to pick 50 Irish lives in Canada, people who made a contribution, large or small, to the evolution of Canada over the years. And part of the inspiration for this conversation is to mark Irish Heritage Month. And to kick things off, we have James Maloney, who sponsored this resolution. And of course, the resolution means that every March from here on out is going to be Irish Heritage Month. So James, first of all, thank you so much for this resolution. It's meant an awful lot to people.
It really has, Ambassador. Thank you for having me. Thank you for doing this. As I've said to you before, I knew it meant a lot to people when I was doing it, but after it was done, the outpouring of emotion and response, it continues to this day, is quite it's overwhelming, frankly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But
I mean, it's strange as well for us to grapple with this as an embassy, because in a way, Canada is known for, the fact that it's in the Commonwealth. It still has, the Queen of Canada, Queen Elizabeth II. And so it has that. We know it for Quebec and the French, and the balance that was struck early on between those two traditions. The Irish is kind of less well known, I think. Is that a fair comment?
Very much so, and as I've also said before, it's because the Irish in Canada have become far too modest, because the impact that the Irish community has had on building this country is immense. You can go into literally every city, every town, every village, every community in Canada, and you can see some aspect of the Irish influence. And that's what really motivated me to introduce this motion. And literally, there's right here in Ottawa, the Rideau Canal. There's landmarks like that across the country that the Irish contributed to building, and they literally helped build this country. So people need to celebrate it more, because over time, people have sort of become too modest and are not recognizing and remembering and vocalizing that great contribution. And that's what Irish Heritage Month is really about, because I'm trying to get away from the stereotypes and focus on just that. And that's why this project that you've started here is so important, because it's going to remind people of exactly that. And the people that are joining you today are people who have been doing that for a long time, and I'm looking forward to hearing more from them.
Yeah, absolutely, James, and thanks again for your contribution in terms of the resolution and Irish Heritage Month. Yeah, I'm really delighted to have historians who've really focused on the Irish contribution to Canada with us this morning. And so what we're going to do is we'll have a chat with each of them, and I've asked them to pick out one or two lives that, in a way, are illustrative of the Irish contribution. I mean, I think one of the things that struck us is there's very few areas of Canadian life or history where the Irish don't pop up. The obvious ones are political. There's the churchmen, but there's pioneers and explorers, writers, journalists, artists, musicians, and so on. And of course, there's also that other part of the story, which is the people who don't necessarily make it into the social, economic, or political elite, but without which there is no society. The people who run the families, keep body and soul together. Very often they're settlers, or they're immigrants building a city, and so on. Maybe Liz, if I turn to you first, you're an emeritus professor at Massey College, and I'd like to hear from you, because you focused on the women religious as people who have made often an extraordinary contribution in very trying circumstances. Do you want to speak about who you've chosen?
Thank you, Ambassador. So the person I have chosen is Mother Teresa Deez, who was born in 1820 in Naz and died in 1889. She was one of the founding members of the Canadian branch of the Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary, the Loretto Sisters. And this is an order dedicated primarily to the education of girls and young women, although they did teach boys in the publicly funded schools. She was an educational innovator, congregational leader, and she shaped the educational landscape. She embodies a largely unstudied cohort of Irish immigrant women who belonged to multiple and intersectional networks, biological, ecclesial, and ethnocultural. She arrived in the middle of the typhus epidemic in 1847 and quickly became a prominent person in the Canadian educational landscape. She was part of this worldwide network of Irish women who taught. When she prayed, she used the same formula as her sisters did in India, Australia, Gibraltar, Mauritius. And in her family itself, her family, the Deez family, embodies the international scope of Irish immigration. As an Irish woman religious, she occupies a unique space in the worldwide Irish ethnocultural network, from the built heritage that she left to the literary work she encouraged that wove and encouraged ties between Ireland and North America. There's much to be said and written about women such as Mother Deez. She celebrated her Irish heritage, never more so and forcefully as when meeting Princess Louise, the wife of the Governor General of Canada, the Marquis of Lorne. Princess Louise said to her, "Oh, you're an English lady." She said, "No, princess, I'm from Dublin."
She was often homesick as well. I was very struck by that.
She was, because when she and the other women, the Irish women who left the mother house at Rathfarnham, they basically were exited with a funeral dirge, because these women would never, for the most part, go back to Ireland again. Teresa Deez herself did return to Ireland. She had two sisters who were living with the Loreto community. One was Loreto in Fermoy. But this whole idea of loneliness, the loneliness of the immigrant experience, was very much also embodied in Deez's experience.
Just give us a sense of the scale of the operation that she left behind. I mean, did I see something like 13 or 14 schools?
Numerous schools, and very successful in recruiting women and encouraging women to join the order. The most iconic school that she established was Loreto Niagara, which is basically overlooking the Horseshoe Falls, and virtually every dignitary that came to Canada viewed the falls from Loreto Niagara.
Right, right. Is she well remembered now?
Within her community, perhaps, but I do not think outside. She grabbed some headlines recently as her body was disinterred from the grounds of Loreto Niagara, which has been sold to the Hilton Corporation for further development of their properties in the falls. And she was reinterred in a cemetery in Niagara Falls. But no, Deez is not. And like many other of the Irish immigrant women religious, they are anonymous, not even mentioned. They were described as the good sisters who taught, cared for orphans, worked in hospitals, but never are they named.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you think about sisters and nuns, they do become anonymous. You don't see them as fully rounded individuals. Just a final word on what kind of personality was she?
Oh, she is someone that I think I would like to have sat down and had dinner with. She was very strategic in where she deployed her women. She encouraged innovation, even in some of the areas which I don't think she personally would have agreed with. She was very much a 19th century lady, but she also acknowledged the changing economic circumstances and encouraged women to, in fact, carry out Mary Ward, the founder of the Loreto Sisters mandate, that someday women will go far. And I think Teresa Deez did go far.
And finally, to say she was a very kind person.
I think she was. She was generous with her time, with her resources to people across economic circumstances. and she wasn't exclusive and across ethnocultural identities.
Thanks so much, Liz. We'll come back for some final comments as well. David Wilson, it's great to have you. Great to have you here.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Editor of the Dictionary of Canadian Biography, but also the author of the famous 2-volume biography of Thomas Darcy Mcgee.
That's right. I spent a good number of years on Thomas Darcy Mcgee, one of the most remarkable Irish Canadians ever to set foot in Canada. Someone who was a revolutionary in 1848, who got out by the skin of his teeth, wanted as a traitor, arrived in Philadelphia, proudly described himself as a traitor to the British government, and wound up as a liberal conservative father of Canadian Confederation, strongly opposed to the Fenians, and equally strongly supportive of what he called a new nationality for Canada, characterized by tolerance, multi-ethnicity, generosity of spirit, and economic independence as much as was possible from the United States and Britain, cultural independence. He wanted to generate a Canadian literature drawing on sources from Ireland, Wales, Scotland, Quebec, France, Britain, everywhere really, within the Canadian immigration world. So that's what I was working on, but I haven't chosen Darcy Mcgee for my two subjects.
I was afraid you were going to say that. Yeah, go ahead.
I've chosen two people, and the first is Ellen Cashman, or Irish Nellie, as she was known. And I chose her because most of the focus on the Irish in Canada has been on men, and it's been on central Canada. And Ellen Cashman was very different. She came to North America, actually to Boston originally, from County Cork in 1860, and she was 15 years old. And she came with her mother and her sister. And a few years later, she and her mother crossed the continent to San Francisco. And she very quickly realized that there was gold in their hills, and she saw no good reason why it should be mined only by men. So in 1873, Ellen Cashman, Irish Nellie, joins an otherwise all-male party of 200 prospectors bound for the gold mining district of Cassiar. This is way up in northern British Columbia. She ran a boarding house and she went prospecting herself. Now, this was really unusual. She decided after a year in the Cassiar to sit out the winter.
What year are we now, David? Sorry.
We're in 1873.
1873, okay.
So you know, she's in her mid-20s at this stage.
Right.
Born in 46. She goes out in 1873, and this is really sort of these are really basic conditions up there in the far north of British Columbia. So she decides to sit out the winter in the warmer climate of Victoria on Vancouver Island. But she learns that the miners in the Cassiar who've remained are in deep trouble. They've run out of supplies, and there was an outbreak of scurvy. It was unlikely that they would survive. So she did something that would have been quite incredible for a man, but even more so for a woman. She went on a relief run, and she persuaded 6 men to join her. And some run it was. For 77 days, they trudged through deep snow, surviving avalanches, -40 temperatures, and violent storms. Only someone who's experienced a northern British Columbia winter can really appreciate this. She got there with her group intact. They nursed the scurvy victims. She distributed food and supplies, and she spent the next 2 years up there in the Cassiar. And not only that, but this was something that characterized her later in life as well. She helped to raise money to build St. Joseph's Hospital in Victoria. She did a lot of charity work with the money she made from prospecting. And then the press gets hold of the story. And this is too good a story to miss. She becomes something of a celebrity. This is when Ellen Cashman becomes Irish Nellie. She had verve, she had courage, She had a keen sense of humor, and she was a woman in a man's world. The miner's angel, they called her, or the angel of the Cassiar. It's a fascinating Irish-Canadian story, and it deserves to be better known.
And I mean, she must have been tough as nails. I mean, that kind of life is not easy. I mean, as you say, even for a man.
Absolutely, she was tough as nails, and she kept on, as an indication of that, she kept on prospecting. I mean, it wasn't just in the Cassiar. She was in Tucson, she was in Tombstone City. She followed the silver, she followed the gold. She was in Mexico for a while, and finally she wound up in Alaska, and she was still prospecting in Alaska in her 70s.
Oh my God.
And
yeah.
she died of, eventually double pneumonia got her when she was at the age of 79. But she was tough as nails, absolutely.
She was never photographed in trousers. She was always photographed in a skirt, as far as I know. But she did wear, of course, trousers and dressed like a man, presumably, in these adventures.
Oh yeah, she would have done, yes.
Yeah. But being tough, she's motivated by philanthropy, really. You know, she's motivated by kindness.
That was certainly a very large part of her story, raising money for various charities, for schools, for hospitals, for example. And also she had a reputation for looking after people. So if miners showed up and they'd run out of money and they showed up at the restaurants that she ran, and these stories come from Tombstone and Tucson, she would give them free food. She would, and sometimes she would give them steaks as well. She'd help them settle, go out and look for gold or silver. So she was very much motivated by charitable works, and exhibited great kindness, great compassion, and great generosity to people in need.
Yeah. I mean, has she entered into the popular culture at all? Because I mean, it's a life worthy of a movie.
Oh, it certainly is. And actually, there are many movies that could be made about Irish Canadians, believe me. She's better known in the United States and better known in Ireland than she is in Canada. In 1994, the United States government issued a postage stamp with her image on it. And more recently, Middleton in County Cork, her hometown, erected a statue in her honor. There's a lot of controversy about statues. This one can stay up.
Well, listen, thanks for bringing our attention to Irish Nellie. It is a fantastic story, and she deserves to be better known than she is, because of not just her physical qualities, but just that kind of the kindness and the motivation to help others. And there's no profit motive in what she's doing at all. I mean, she does run some small businesses here and there, a hotel and that, but she's clearly driven by love of her fellow humans, but also by nature, presumably, as well. I mean, she's out there. She loves the freedom.
Oh, yes. And this was the kind of freedom that she could never have had back home.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thanks, David. Jane McKee, welcome.
Hello.
So I'm really interested in who you're going to pick, because people are making great choices, but not necessarily the expected ones. So who have you got in mind?
Well, like David, I had two in mind. So depending on time, I might come back. But I'm going to start with James Fitzgibbon, who might be slightly better known, but who I think is definitely deserving of a stronger place in Irish Canadian memory than what he has had so far. He was born in 1780 in County Limerick. He was a teenager when he first joined the militia in Ireland before the 1798 rising. He was out of the country actually for 1798, so he didn't fight then. He comes to Upper Canada in the early 1800s. He's briefly in Lower Canada in 1803. And he's mostly remembered now as the guy that Laura Secord was trying to get to, the sort of take me to Fitzgibbon. And if you push a bit more in Toronto history, he's slightly known for his associations with the 1837 rebellion. But really between the early 1800s and all the way up to the famine, he was one of the best known Irish people in Upper Canada. He was as one historian called them, sort of the one-man riot squad that people would go to whenever there were problems with Irish settlers coming in and expectations of violence. He was born Catholic. He converted at some point, probably to ensure a better military career, because there were still effects from the penal laws at that point. And he becomes known as sort of the protege of Major General Sir Isaac Brock. There's a huge possibility of looking into sort of his relationship with Brock and the manliness aspect of it, which is often what I tend to go towards in my research. And he then, after the War of 1812, settles in and has, oh God, over half a dozen different posts with the family compact, but is really remembered for things like the Ballygiblin riots, where Irish settlers had been brought in 1823, and there were a lot of violent altercations going on, and in order to try to—
Sorry, is this Catholic Protestant tensions?
They call it old settler versus the Irish, but
Okay.
there's a lot of Orange influence in certainly the first sheriffs and others who were sent out to deal with the riot. And in the end, Fitzgibbon is tapped to go in as this sort of known military hero, but he's sent in by himself. And instead of sort of trying to negotiate only with the old settlers, he turns to the Irish and then starts speaking in Irish and sort of quells the violence immediately. So drawing on his Irish Catholic heritage, he was accepted, but he also was this establishment figure, and so he could work with some of the older settlers from the colony as well. And then he had to do the same thing in Cornwall. And he was brought in to deal with William Lyon Mackenzie in Toronto when he was having various rallies that were getting out of hand. So he became this extremely, almost over the top Superman type of figure,
Right.
who just was who you would call when you needed someone to bring back peace and order. And then he gets to the 1837 rebellion. By this point, he's in his early 60s. He's still sort of the key figure that people will turn to. He has a horrible run-in with the lieutenant governor, who is not the greatest person ever to be sent out to the colony, Sir Francis Bondhead, who was inept, to be charitable to him. And Fitzgibbon is trying to get preparations done, and Bondhead is blocking him constantly. In the end, he's finally given command to go and deal with William Lyon Mackenzie and the rebels. And then he makes a stand trying to make sure that the forces don't overdo it, that they don't fire David Gibson's house, that they don't make it a punitive measure, and he's overruled. So he gives up his commission. He's this sort of, as I said, over the top, honorable, old-fashioned figure. He almost seems like, he's telling my students, it's like he comes out of a Jane Austen novel. Like you just have to brace yourself that he's this other timely type that doesn't really fit in modern society. And so when you hear about all of his various accolades, you tend to roll your eyes. And in the end, he had to leave the colony in 1847 when so many people are trying to get into Canada. He leaves. He was in financial ruins by that point and had been treated fairly shabbily by the Upper Canadian and then the provincial Canadian government after the rebellion, and ends up spending the last 13 years of his life at Windsor Castle, of all places.
Doing what?
He was a retired knight, and so was given sort of like the Chelsea pensioners are, sort of a place of retirement that was afforded to him. And he's basically forgotten in Canada. When he died, there was only 2 lines about him in the Toronto newspapers. And if he is remembered, it's always for his associations with other people, not for the really central role that he had for many decades. But part of that is because he was a British imperial officer. And it's that question of, how do we confront Irishness and imperial spaces? He's in the British uniform, but he absolutely gloried in his Irishness. Anna Jamison, who was another Irish woman in the colonies in the 1830s, writes about their friendship and how he really put Irishness as the crux of why he'd succeeded in life. It was central to his identity. But it doesn't fit with what we think of as being, an Irish leader. He's not a revolutionary. He doesn't have any type of Republican background. And so he was easy to overlook. And I don't think there are any statues to him. There's one line about him on the blue plaque for the Ballygiblin riots. And yeah, so he would be my choice for someone to go back to a bit more.
Of course, Anna Jamison, née Murphy, was a big fan of his as well. She was the travel writer.
She was indeed, yeah. And she wrote quite a bit about him. She called him Colonel F in her writings, and she went on about how she enjoyed original men, and that he was originalissimo. He was her ultimate. And they talked about their Irish backgrounds, and
because she's Dublin born and raised.
Yeah. So they had that in common, and it's one of those things. I'm always fascinated with people who have Irish backgrounds, but because of the public role they had, it's assumed that they were English. And
would you ascribe his kind of mediation diplomatic skills to the fact that he was Irish? I mean, he reminds me a bit of Guy Carleton as well. This
very much
kind of occupying these gray spaces, which they seem to do very empathetically.
Yeah, I mean, I think the fact that he spoke Irish was fundamental to his role within Ballygiblin. He then was involved in chastising the Orangemen immediately afterwards, and calling them out on sort of very moral Christian grounds that they were failing in duties of brotherhood. So he absolutely was someone who would take people to task, but he does occupy this gray area, which makes him easier to forget.
Right. At some other point, I'd love to talk to you about Alias Grace, the Netflix show.
Oh yes, yeah.
Yeah, well, we might come back to her, but for the moment, thanks so much, Jane. And in fact, your theme of the Imperial Irish brings us to Mark McGowan from St. Michael's College, Toronto. Mark, how are you?
Very well, thanks, Ambassador.
Yeah. So who have you chosen? I've pegged you as the man for the Irish imperialists, but you're probably going to surprise me and pick somebody else, are you?
Well, I'm working on 1,700 Irish famine orphans who are not recorded whatsoever in history. But I decided to do something rather stereotypical for the principal of a Catholic college, and that is I'm going to talk about John Joseph Lynch, who was Archbishop of Toronto from 1860 to 1888. And really, I chose him because he really embodies a kind of ultramontane Irishness that sort of is foundational in the church in English-speaking Canada as a complement and also as a rivalry to the church in French-speaking Canada. He was born actually in a little appendix of the parish of Clones, which typically would be in Monaghan, but this little bit sticks into Fermanagh. So he was a proud Ulsterman through and through with both his Monaghan and Fermanagh roots. And he became a member of the Vicentian order. Now, it's only by the accident of being bitten by a mosquito that John Joseph Lynch ever comes to Canada, because he wanted to be a missionary in Texas. And that's where he went first in the early 19th century. So in the 1840s, he's mulling about, he gets bitten, gets malaria, treating soldiers during the Mexican War for the United States, and then ends up in the Niagara to recuperate. Now, from there, it becomes history for Lynch. Lynch founds Niagara University, which is still in existence. He's noticed by the Torontonians, who are rather disgruntled by the fact that their bishop, Armand de Charbonnel, is planning to retire. And so he actually becomes coadjutor bishop of Toronto in 1859 and becomes bishop full-blown in 1860. Now, one of the reasons I choose him, because there's a lot of Irish bishops in Canada at the time. But one of the interesting things about Lynch is that he's not part of the Cullenite network. Cardinal Cullen's, as Colin Barr describes it, that broad Irish empire of Catholicism that stretches Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, the United States, and in Ireland itself. And in the eastern part of Canada, but Lynch is quite different, and I think it's because of his personality. He's very jealous of his territory, and he wants to implement what he thinks the new church is in his province, and he creates a massive infrastructure. I mean, of Catholic schools, the foundations in encouraging a Catholic university like St. Michael's, which was actually founded before he got there, but he really wanted to make it in his own image, much to the chagrin of the Basilian orders. He was hard on the sisters, and I won't. There will be, and I see Liz nodding her head, because he was definitely very hard on the sisters, because he had an image in his mind of how Catholic education, Catholic healthcare, and social services ought to run, and it should be run essentially from the top. So he was very very much a top-down bishop. He was also a clerical nationalist, and so he had dealings with Mcgee. He had flirtations, sometimes with people who had far more radical ideas than where Lynch was prepared to go. But one of the things in his nationalism, in a famous sermon he gives on St. Patrick's Day in 1875, he talks about the providential mission of the Irish in Canada, not the United States, not in Great Britain, but as really being emissaries of the Catholic faith through the English language, you know, in this country. Is also quite a political chameleon. And that's why I find fascinating about him. Jerry Stortz, who was really his biographer about 40 years ago, talks about his alliances with politicians of different stripes. James will appreciate this. At the provincial level, Oliver Mowat was the Liberal premier, and he cuts deals with Mowat in order to get what he needs for Catholic schools, the blocking of the incorporation of the Orange Order and the like. But federally, he has a cozy relationship with John A. Macdonald, the conservative leader, again, with a quid pro quo. I will deliver votes as you need them federally if you provide certain things to my community. He really fancied himself a Catholic power broker. And one of the sides that we don't get to see very often about Lynch is his spirituality. He becomes one of the first international bishops to embrace the apparitions at Knock. And in fact, even has plaster from the church at Knock in Toronto, and people write him letters to get this, the plaster for its alleged powers. And that spirituality also leads him to butt heads with various Protestants, although generally speaking, as a kind of a political animal, he does get along with many of the Protestant leaders. It's when Ulster Presbyterian preachers end up in Toronto that he really comes to his own. And I just wanted to give a kind of a final vignette of Lynch, who was a cartoonist delight. In the mid-1870s, he begins to joust with a Protestant minister who has just arrived from Northern Ireland at Cook's Presbyterian Church, named, of course, famously after the great Presbyterian of Ulster, Cook. And one of the, on a Sunday night at St. Michael's Cathedral, Archbishop Lynch would get up and then offer a homily, or sometimes a discussion of how Protestants and Catholics differ and the beauty and truth of the Catholic faith. Rob, the next Sunday evening, would get up in his pulpit at Cook's and refute everything that Lynch said prior Sunday. And it went back and forth. It was, how should we say, Victorian drama before reality television. And people flocked of all stripes to hear Lynch, who was a very good speaker, and also to hear Rob. And because he was a cartoonist delight, a kind of a Canadian style punch called The Grip was a regular political cartoonist magazine run by J.W. Bengoff, who ironically was from, spent some time in Whitby, where I am. Bengoff does his signs of the zodiac in Canadian politics, but as Pisces, he has two fish crossed like this, one with Lynch's head and one with Rob's head, these two Irishmen. And the little poem that goes with it, "O ye gods and little fishes to rejoice, you may be robbed or lynched, so take your choice." And it was a wonderful little poem. The other thing that's in closing, he was very much the ultramontane's ultramontane. He shows up at the First Vatican Council, 1869, 1870, and he is an intrepid infallibilist. So much so that during the council, I've actually found his handwritten notes where he took down the name of every bishop who voted non-placet, that is not pleasing to the whole idea of infallibility. He wanted to know who they were, and he wanted to remember, including his colleague from Cork, Thomas Lewis Connolly, then Archbishop of Halifax, who actually voted non-placet. These two had an interesting history, but that's a subject for another day.
Great, thanks, Mark. I suppose the other dimension to it is confederation and the kind of his and other fellow Irish bishops and their view of confederation. Could you just say a couple of words about that?
Yeah, what's really interesting about, I've written on it and called it uncomfortable pews, because the French Canadian bishops had a different idea of how Confederation might unfold. But actually, this was a time when Lynch and Connolly were powerfully pro-Confederation. Certainly the correspondence between Lynch and MacDonald is clear that Lynch thinks Confederation is a good idea. But what Connolly and Lynch are most concerned about is if the provincial powers include education, what's going to happen to Catholic schools, particularly in those provinces like Ontario and the province of Nova Scotia, where they are a minority. And so it's actually Connolly who does the lobbying in Westminster in 1866 to actually, with the help and influence of Thomas Darcy Mcgee of the side, to actually implement Section 93 of the British North America Act, now the Constitution Act, which guarantees Catholic schools as they existed in 1867, only for Ontario and Quebec, and with the powers of federal remediation should a province try to usurp those rights. Lynch is key in this, and Connolly is upfront. Of course, it's unrequited for Connolly because, as we know, what happens in Nova Scotia is over time, the gentleman's agreement fades and Catholic schools are essentially eliminated, at least as being recipients of the public purse. But that's where the Irish Catholic bishops in Canada stood. If we can preserve education, Confederation is a good thing because we don't want to be in the hands of the likes of George Brown and the Orange Order. Close.
That's great, Mark. Just, I suppose, a tough question in a way, because you talk so much about the Catholic Church and so on, and there's a lot of empty churches around nowadays. What is the lasting kind of legacy of people like Lynch in terms of Canada today?
Well, probably Lynch and others, because they create this, it is a tough question. They do create an infrastructure that's still in use, although weak, depending on what part of the country that you're in. And so when you think of these ultramontane Irish bishops who encouraged the emigration of religious orders, who created colleges and schools, who invested in social services, in hospitals, I think that's a powerful legacy. And also, in a sense, resisted being assimilated, and this is a kind of a stormy part of that Irish Catholic Canadian history, being assimilated under the control of the church in Quebec, which was recognized as being strong and trying to extend its influence. And so there are darker chapters here, Ambassador, with regard to intra-Catholic relations, specifically regarding language and ethnicity. And by the way, for anybody who grew up in Ottawa, like I did, that legacy is still there, but below the surface. So.
Right. As a final point, is it true to say that in their role, and you spoke about the kind of visionary role as well, that they make Canada a place, easier place for the Irish to settle in as citizens?
I think what they did was they created an infrastructure, at least for Irish Catholics. It certainly was unsettling for Irish Protestants to have someone like
yeah.
Lynch
I should say
others.
The Irish Catholic immigrants. Maybe.
Yeah, but I mean, when you create that structure for migration, for that migrants can slide into, build, engage, and then in some way gain ownership, I think that's an important feature. But I have to also sort of caution that the Catholic Church manifests itself in different ways in different regions of the country. And so reception was easier in some places. For example, Halifax, which was one of Connolly's bones of contention with Lynch. Lynch didn't want to see any more Irish come because he didn't believe Toronto was a great place for them, not the least of which because of the strength of the Orange Order. In fact, he issues a letter to the Irish bishops called The Evils of Improvident Irish Migration. Connolly thinks the opposite. In Halifax, he thinks that this is the place where Irish should come, better than the United States, better than staying in Ireland. But I mean, Halifax is a completely different Irish story from the story that takes place in Montreal, okay, or takes place in Ottawa, or takes place even Toronto or Winnipeg. So it's a complicated answer. I'm really sounding like a politician on this one.
No, that's great. And I'm conscious of the time, but I'd like to kind of do a kind of a wrap up. And to go back to Liz, maybe if you want to either respond to the point about the bishop being hard on women and the role of women in the religious women in Canada under a kind of a, well, specifically under patriarchy, but any broader comments on the kind of the Irish Canadian story?
Just picking up on what Mark said, I think that the best way to describe issues around Irish immigrant women religious is it's complicated. And issues, we haven't talked about class and the extent to which class intersects with a lot of this discussion. And back to Jane's point, like how can you at the same time be both imperialist and a proud Irish person? Teresa Deez, who I spoke about, she was the child of a military surgeon. And it was only because of the benevolence of the British Army that she and her siblings survived. They were orphaned. So it was the benevolent fund that launches them off. David's point about Irish Nelly, I'm going to take a leap here, because the ethnicity makes strange alliances, and how someone that could be perceived as completely disreputable ends up in league with, like, naming a hospital St. Joseph's Hospital in Victoria. I'm going to have to pursue that one a bit. So I think that just in summary, that that it's a complicated relationship that Irish women religious have. There is conflict, there is intra and inter-congregational conflict, there is inter and intra hierarchical challenges. There's a lot of kissing the robe, kissing the purple of your robe, I remain, obedience stated, and yet they are weaving ways to get what they want in spite of what the hierarchy says.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point to say that things are complicated, and we haven't even touched on the relationship between the Irish and the Indigenous or the residential schools. I mean, that's a whole other dimension that requires separate focus in a way. And Jane, any thoughts from you? Thanks, Liz.
I think that Liz's point about class is also very key, that in a lot of the historiography, we are talking about middle or upper class Irish men. And as David said, there's a need for more stories about Irish women in Canadian history. And the stories are there, but they're not well known. They're difficult to find, and they're difficult for people to remember. We don't have that sort of shorthand of myths and legends as easily. People remember Darcy Mcgee. People will remember things like the Black Rock or the moment of the famine, the Heritage Minute, and all of its problematic issues that I heard Mark speak about once. But I think what I look forward to is a lot more gendered history coming forward. Things like, as you mentioned, Alias Grace and its role in bringing Grace Marks back to public attention. But she's known as a notorious murderess. And that class problem is still there as well, that when we do talk about people from the working classes, the laboring classes, it's often because of criminality, which is such a loaded stereotype, and it also takes a lot of nuance to try and untangle. So I think there are a lot of places for the story to go, but I think there's also a need to try to break into pop culture a bit with it, and that's not always easy to do.
Yeah, Grace Marks, and also the women in asylums and lunatic asylums and hospitals and the records. I think, weren't you doing some work on?
Yes, yeah, that's
on trying to get that story from, in a way, the bottom of society, or people who are put at the bottom of society, and that's a lot of hard work, and going through the records and putting out patterns.
It's really a bit uncomfortable at times, because when you do hear about some of these women who have been incarcerated, they don't actually talk about them as human beings. I was reading just the other day about mothers who were giving birth in the Beauport Asylum, and they talk about the work of the uterus, the woman is not involved in it. And that was part of the Victorian medical discourse. But yeah, it's a lot of work to go through to try and find these voices, but I think it's worth the effort. And hopefully the project that I'm working on now with the asylums will add another layer to rather than just that brief second that we get in Alias Grace of her being put in the provincial lunatic asylum in Toronto. And then I think it's on screen for about 10 seconds, but there's a lot more to it than that.
Yeah, no, certainly a subject I think we could come back to is history and women and kind of disinterring their story and what it tells us, because it's not just Canada, it's universal. I mean, there's a very interesting article about how Irish words referring to specific women's body parts and gynecology actually erased out of the translation. So it's quite a fascinating process as well. But it's about burying the individual woman and so on. So it's certainly something worth coming back to. You know, David, any kind of roundup thoughts from you?
Certainly, I think one of the most striking things about the conversation we've had and about the experiences of the Irish in Canada generally is just how variegated those experiences are. And the Irish, Protestant and Catholic alike, energized all levels of Canadian society. We must remember that the Irish were the most important ethnic group outside French Canada during the 19th century. So in terms of politics, society, culture, economics, finance, business, the Irish are there at every level. And we think about the importance of Orangism in Canada. Canada was a bastion of Orangism. And the 12th of July Orange parades historically were much more important in Canada than the St. Patrick's Day parades, attracted far more people and had much more endurance. That's clearly not the case now, but it was in the 19th and for much of the 20th century. There are other aspects as well. There's the Fenian tradition in Canada that I've been working on over the last few years, a minority tradition that waxes and wanes, but that in the 1860s was quite influential. And one of Bishop Lynch's principal antagonists was the founder of Fenianism in Canada, Michael Murphy. And we could have a full-length story about him as well, full-length film about him as well. Yeah. We have gender issues. We have the orphans that Mark is studying. We have the canal workers. We have farmers. Most Irish Canadians, Protestant and Catholic alike, were farmers. They lived in the countryside and they worked in farms. We need to know more about them. We have the urban areas of poverty. Willie Jenkins is working on the Irish in one street in Toronto, Stanley Street, which was a kind of byword for Irish depravity. Not everyone who lived there was Irish, in fact, and not everyone who lived there was depraved, in fact. That was the image it had. So there are so many areas of Irish Canadian life that are being explored, that have been explored, and that can be explored. And it's the richness and diversity of those experiences that I would emphasize.
Right. And just reading back to Mark, I suppose one thing which is kind of interesting as well, if we pull back from individual lives, it looks like, and again, going back up to the more political level, it looks like Canada is shaped with reference to essentially three countries. It's shaped by its relationship with Britain and a subset of the French within that, but Britain. It's shaped by, in a way, horror about what's going on in the United States and eventual civil war. But it's also shaped by what's going on in Ireland. You know, in a way, Thomas Darcy Mcgee is shaping Canada on doing exactly the opposite to what the British were doing in Ireland. You know, and that they all of the people that we've talked about are, in a way, looking at Canada through the lens of their own Irish experience in some way, whether that's an historic awareness like Thomas Darcy Mcgee had, or it's the awareness of different perspectives like Fitzgibbon brings to us, or Mcgee himself, or the empathy that Irish Nelly would bring to it. You know, so Ireland kind of looms there as well as a kind of as a resource, as a source of metaphor and analysis and understanding, you know. Just circling back to you then, Mark, for some final comments.
Yeah, I think what we've touched on are really several important things. And first of all, that the Canadian Irish stories are quite unique because they are situated in Canada, and that for so long, you know, perhaps a noisy neighbor to the south has sort of dominated the conversation with regard to who the Irish are, what Irish nationalism is, and what Irish Catholicism is. And I think what we're learning over the last 3 decades, and at least since the seminal work of Don Akinson in the 1980s, is that the Canadian story, and I'd say stories, are very different because of many of the influences that our panel has pointed out today, and that in particular to the idea that the Irish in Canada come to different communities and to different regions, and they manifest different things within their history within that region. And I think so unique Canadian story, but also unique regional stories of the Irish. I find it really hard. If you wanted to ask me a really complicated question, Ambassador, it would be, you know, what is an Irish Canadian? Because that's a terrifically complicated set of stories. And I think finally, what we're touching on is now a new historiography, kind of looking at the Irish from the bottom up. So addressing long questions that have not been addressed about gender, about class, about interracial engagement between the Irish and the other, depending on who the other is. It could be French Canadian, it could be OG Cree. You know, there are so many new vistas. And it's sometimes in those stories, and Jane really touches on it when you talk about Alias Grace, but it's the story of the simple, the common Irish folk that land here. And I can't help but, you know, wax on the orphans who never in a million years think they're going to be leaving Ireland during the famine and end up in a strange country. And their first point of encounter is either St. John, New Brunswick or Quebec, where they don't even speak the language for the most part. And sometimes don't even speak the English language when they arrive in St. John because they're Irish speakers. But how those seeds that are planted by these unnamed, unknown children up until very recently really have their own trajectory of stories. So here's one. Edward Nielan from Coolmeen, County Clare, comes to Quebec. His parents are dead, and he's taken in, not adopted, he's taken in by the McCarthy family, an Irish family, not a French Canadian family, pre-famine Irish who are living in the environ of Quebec. He has a son. That son has a daughter who marries, and his granddaughter is a woman called Josie Quart. Josie Quart is one of the first women appointed to the Canadian Senate, this time by John Diefenbaker, and Larry Zolf waxes on Josie Quart because she's known for her Lauren Bacall voice, her broad brimmed hats, and her ability to sniff out Bolsheviks wherever they are. But this is the granddaughter of an Irish famine orphan who, in a sense, you know, takes that seed of the unknown and then becomes the known and influential in her own way in the 1950s. So I think the stories out there are legion, and they have to be treated within the context in which they have been cultivated here in Canadian soil. Ambassador, I don't know how you're going to limit it to 50.
Yeah, somebody said, well, yeah, we can easily get to 50. We may not easily pick 50. So, but also your point on the intergenerational is so on as well, because, you know, as you recall in our first conversations around this, we said we don't limit it to the Irish born. We're in trouble. So at least we'll start there anyway, and we'll see where it goes. But listen, I'd like to thank you all for your really interesting contributions and for opening up vistas into the story of the Irish in Canada, which, as you say, Mark, is, you know, stories. They're all creating their own narratives, which then eventually become, in a way, a collective, you know. James, a final word from you. Did you get as much out of this conversation as I did?
Did I ever? I'm speechless on the one hand and in awe on the other. I mean, the next time, if somebody asks me why was Irish Heritage Month so important, if you don't mind, I'm going to get them to watch this discussion. You know, Mark said, how do you describe being Irish and Canadian? that's, that was one of the questions I asked myself when I did this in the first place. And, watching this today makes me realize that I should probably change it from Irish Heritage Month to Irish Canadian Heritage Month, because the story of Canada is really the story of the Irish in Canada. And this discussion today really proved that. We talked about British Columbia, Northern British Columbia and Vancouver Island. We talked about Niagara Falls area. We talked about Toronto. We talked about Halifax. We talked about Quebec. It's literally across the country. It's had impact on our social development, whether it's education, religion, finance. It touches on literally everything. And it's remarkable. I agree with Mark again. I was going to say the same thing. I don't know how you're going to stop at 50. You're going to have to say 50 Irish Lives Volume 1 and go from there. But and it's a story about women too, which is very important. I was so pleased to hear that part of the discussion today, because as you know, Ambassador, my mother was a very vocal advocate for women in politics and in business, and she sat in the Senate herself for a period of time. So it's something that's very important to me. The next time somebody uses the phrase tough as nails, I'm going to say, no, it's tough as Nelly. I mean, look, that's
yeah,
that story right there is remarkable. And the things that, David talked about, what Darcy McGee, his vision for Canada and what it should represent, and the ideas that it should adopt. That's what Canada is now.
no,
He was right. That's why he's so important in our history. So I could go on and on. And listen, I'll finish with this. In the past 3 weeks in Ottawa, I wish we had a Colonel Fitzgibbons, because we needed somebody with those skills and that strength to come in and deal with the issues we've unfortunately had to deal with lately. But as an ambassador, thank you for doing this. I mean, you've brought to life an idea I had, and I really look forward to the ongoing discussion.
Great, thank you, James. And yeah, I think maybe a final word on Canada itself, that in a way, it was Canada that allowed these Irish to express themselves and develop their talents in a way they could never have done at home. The Canada is what it is because it had that expansiveness, it had that capacity, it had that openness. So listen, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. And I think there's an awful lot of themes and stories that we can pick up again, and we'll certainly do that. I was very taken, Jane, as well, by some of your references to murder mysteries. Maybe we'll come back for a special session in Halloween around that. So listen, thanks again, everybody, and have a happy St. Patrick's Day and a great Irish Heritage Month.